Consider an evening alone. The obligations of the day have been fulfilled, and what lies ahead is simply time. Hours of it. Nothing demands your attention. No one will call or visit. You sit with only your thoughts, and the quiet surrounds you completely. For some people, this is torture. The walls seem to close in. The minutes drag. They reach for their phone, turn on the television, call a friend, arrange to meet someone, do anything to avoid being alone with themselves. For others, it is relief. The performance can end, the mask can come off, they can finally be themselves without the exhausting work of being acceptable to others. For most, it is something in between, a mixture of freedom and unease. The pleasure of not having to perform mixed with the discomfort of having no one to perform for. The relief of privacy shadowed by the question, what do I do now that no one is watching? What do we discover when we are alone? What do we flee from, and what do we find? These are not merely psychological questions about personality type or social preference. They are philosophical questions about the nature of human existence, about what we are when the social world is stripped away, about whether there is anything at the core of us or only an emptiness that must be filled from outside. Arthur Schopenhauer thought more carefully about these questions than almost anyone. He was a philosopher who spent much of his life alone by choice, who believed that the capacity to be alone was the mark of intellectual and spiritual development, who wrote that a man can be himself only so long as he is alone. If he does not love solitude, he will not love freedom, for it is only when he is alone that he is really free. This was not the casual observation of someone who occasionally enjoyed quiet time. It was a central conviction, rooted in his understanding of human nature and the structure of existence itself. Schopenhauer believed that most people flee solitude because they cannot bear their own company. They have nothing within. Their minds are empty, their thoughts trivial, their inner life a void. Without external stimulation, without the noise and movement of society, they discover this emptiness and cannot endure it. So they fill their time with distraction, with busyness, with other people, with anything that prevents them from facing what they are when no one else is present. But for those who have cultivated an inner life, who have developed thoughts worth thinking and interests worth pursuing, solitude is not a privation but a gift. It is the condition under which they can finally be themselves, under which they can think clearly, perceive accurately, exist without the constant distortion that comes from performing for others. Schopenhauer was not an easy man. He was bitter, misanthropic, often cruel in his judgments of others. He had few friends and seemed to prefer it that way. He lived alone for decades, following a routine that never varied, content with his books and his thoughts and his poodle. He wrote philosophy that stripped away comforting illusions and presented existence as fundamentally characterized by suffering. But he also wrote philosophy that helped people understand why they suffered, what the alternatives were, and how one might live in an unbearable world. He offered not cheerful advice but honest reflection, not happiness but clarity, not the promise that life would get better, but the wisdom to endure life as it is. His philosophy of solitude is not a self-help guide. It is not a list of tips for enjoying alone time or becoming more comfortable with yourself. It is something deeper and darker and ultimately more useful, an analysis of what it means to be human, what most humans are like, why most humans cannot bear to be alone, and how one might develop the inner resources that make solitude not merely bearable, but preferable to the company of most people. This is a philosophy for those who have felt the relief of closing the door on the world, for those who have wondered whether their preference for solitude is wisdom or dysfunction, for those who have sat in a quiet room and felt both the freedom and the weight of having only themselves for company. Schopenhauer offers no easy answers. He believed that existence was suffering and that most of what passed for happiness was merely distraction from this fact. He believed that most people were not worth knowing and that society was a theatre of vanity and stupidity. He believed that the best one could hope for was not joy, but the reduction of pain, not fulfillment, but the absence of acute suffering. This is cold comfort, but it is comfort nonetheless. And for those who have already seen through the cheerful lies that most people tell themselves, it may be the only honest comfort available. The question is not whether Schopenhauer was right about everything. He was not. His views on women were indefensible. His elitism about intellect was often cruel. His pessimism sometimes tipped into mere bitterness. But the question is whether he saw something true about the human condition, about what most people are like, about why solitude is difficult and what it takes to make it bearable. Whether his philosophy can help those who find themselves alone, by choice or circumstance, to understand what they are experiencing and how they might live through it. The room is quiet. The hours stretch ahead. What do you do when no one is watching? What do you discover when the performance ends? What is there, at the core, when everything external is stripped away? Schopenhauer believed that for most people the answer is nothing, an inner void, an emptiness that must be filled from outside or else becomes unbearable. But he also believed that this void could be filled from within, that one could cultivate thoughts, interests, capacities for contemplation that made solitude not a privation but a condition of freedom, that the inner life could be developed until one's own company became preferable to that of others. This is the work, not of an evening or a weekend, but of a lifetime, the cultivation of a self-worth being alone with. Schopenhauer can show us what this cultivation looks like, why it matters, and what it reveals about the nature of human existence. He is not a cheerful guide, but he is an honest one. And for those sitting alone in quiet rooms, wondering whether their solitude is prison or refuge, his philosophy offers a way to understand the question and perhaps in time to answer it. From the beginning, there was tension. Heinrich wanted his son to become a merchant, to inherit the family business, to be practical and successful in worldly terms. But the boy showed early signs of intellectual inclination, of preferring books to commerce, thought to action. When Arthur was 5, the family moved to Hamburg after Danzig was annexed by Prussia. Heinrich valued freedom above all else and would not live under Prussian rule. This love of independence, this refusal to submit to authority he did not respect, would mark his son's character throughout his life. Heinrich offered his son a choice when Arthur was 15. Either continue his education and pursue an intellectual career, or travel through Europe and then join the family business. If Arthur chose education, there would be no going back. The business career would be closed to him. If he chose business, he would see the world but surrender his intellectual ambitions. Arthur chose business, or rather, he felt he had no choice. His father's will was strong, and the boy was not yet confident enough in his own path to resist. He travelled through Europe for 2 years, seeing France, England, Holland, Austria. The experience was broadening but also alienating. He was developing a sensibility that did not fit the merchant world his father inhabited. Then in 1805, when Arthur was 17, his father died. The official story was that Heinrich Floris Schopenhauer fell from the upper floor of a warehouse into a canal and drowned. But Arthur believed, and most historians agree, that it was suicide. His father had been showing signs of increasing mental disturbance, perhaps depression, perhaps early dementia. He walked into the warehouse, climbed to the upper floor, and fell or threw himself into the water below. Arthur was devastated. His father's death released him from the obligation to become a merchant, but it also left him with guilt and grief he would carry for the rest of his life. He had complied with his father's wishes without truly wanting to. Now his father was gone, and the possibility of reconciliation, of being understood, was gone with him. The family fortune remained. Heinrich had been a successful merchant, and Arthur inherited enough wealth to live comfortably without working. This financial independence would prove crucial. It freed him from the need to make his philosophy marketable, to conform to academic trends, to please anyone but himself. He could think what he wanted and say what he thought without fear of losing his livelihood. But the inheritance came with a price. His mother Johanna, now a widow at 37, moved to Weimar and established herself as a successful novelist and salon hostess. She was sociable, charming, connected. Her home became a gathering place for artists and intellectuals. Goethe was a regular visitor. She thrived in society. Arthur did not. He was gloomy, critical, pessimistic. He saw through social performances and said so. He pointed out pretensions and hypocrisies. He was not fun at parties. Mother and son did not get along. Johanna found Arthur's gloominess unbearable. She had lost her husband and did not want to be reminded of death and suffering. She wanted to live, to enjoy her freedom, to shine in society. Arthur represented everything she was trying to escape. Arthur, for his part, resented his mother's seeming indifference to his father's death, her easy adaptation to widowhood, her social success. He saw her as superficial, as caring more for reputation than truth, as embodying everything that was false about society. The break came in 1814. Arthur was 26. He visited his mother in Weimar and criticized her lifestyle, her friends, her writing. Johanna responded that she would not tolerate his gloominess, his arrogance, his constant judgment. She told him that he bored and annoyed her. She suggested he leave. He did. They would see each other only once more in the remaining 42 years of his life. When they met by chance years later, they exchanged cold pleasantries and parted. When Johanna died in 1838, Arthur did not attend the funeral. This rupture was not merely personal drama. It shaped Schopenhauer's view of human relationships, of the possibility of understanding between people, of the gap between what we are and what we pretend to be. His mother represented society, performance, the maintenance of pleasant surfaces. He represented truth, darkness, the refusal to pretend that life was anything other than what he saw it to be. That he could not maintain a relationship even with his own mother confirmed what he already suspected, that most people cannot tolerate honesty, that they prefer comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths, that anyone who sees clearly will necessarily be isolated from those who do not. This was not mere misanthropy, though there was misanthropy in it. It was a philosophical position that most humans are not capable of facing reality, that they construct elaborate systems of distraction and self-deception, and that anyone who refuses to participate in these systems will be rejected by those who need them to survive. Schopenhauer began his formal education late. At 19, after his father's death, he entered the gymnasium at Gotha to prepare for university. At 21, he entered the University of Göttingen to study medicine, then switched to philosophy. At 23, he moved to Berlin to study under Johann Gottlieb Fichte. He was not impressed. Fichte lectured on elaborate idealist systems that seemed to Schopenhauer to be empty word spinning. Philosophy as performance rather than genuine inquiry into truth. The young Schopenhauer sat in the lectures taking notes, but his notes were often sarcastic comments about the emptiness of what he was hearing. He did, however, encounter the philosophy that would shape his own, Kant's critical philosophy and the Upanishads of Indian thought, which he read in a Latin translation. From Kant, He took the distinction between the world as it appears to us and the world as it is in itself. From Indian philosophy, he took the idea that the world is illusion, that individuality is a kind of mistake, that liberation comes through seeing through appearances to the underlying reality. He would spend the rest of his life working out the implications of these ideas, building a philosophical system that combined German idealism and Indian pessimism into something original and dark and compelling. But first, he had to live through decades of obscurity, of being ignored, of having his work dismissed or simply not read. First, he had to learn what it meant to be right about something important and have no one care. In 1813, at age 25, Arthur Schopenhauer completed his doctoral dissertation at the University of Jena. The title was On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, a dry title for a work that was actually quite radical. Schopenhauer was investigating why we believe that everything has a reason, that nothing happens without cause, that the world is intelligible rather than chaotic. His answer was that this principle of sufficient reason operates in 4 different domains: in becoming, where every event has a cause; in knowing, where every judgment has a ground; in being, where every part of space and time has a relation to the whole; and in acting, where every action has a motive. These are not truths about the world in itself, but about how our minds structure experience. We cannot know the world as it is. We can only know it as it appears to us, structured by these principles. This was good philosophy, rigorous and original, but hardly anyone noticed. It was a doctoral dissertation, published in a small edition, read by a handful of academics. Schopenhauer expected recognition. He got silence. Undeterred, he began work on his major work. He spent 5 years writing, thinking, revising. He believed he was discovering something fundamental about the nature of reality, something that would change philosophy. He worked with intense focus, living on his inheritance, seeing almost no one, devoted entirely to the work. In 1818, when he was 30, he published The World as Will and Representation. It was a complete philosophical system, ambitious and comprehensive. In the first book, he explained Kant's distinction between appearance and reality, between the world as representation and the thing in itself. In the second book, he identified the thing in itself as will, blind striving without purpose or goal. In the third book, he analysed art as temporary escape from the will. In the fourth book, he described asceticism and the denial of the will as the path to liberation from suffering. He believed it was a masterwork. He compared himself to Kant, to Plato. He thought philosophy would have to reckon with what he had done. The book sank without a trace. A few copies sold. A few brief reviews appeared, most dismissive. The philosophical world was dominated by Hegel and the German idealists, by elaborate system building and historical dialectics. Schopenhauer's philosophy, with its emphasis on suffering and illusion and the futility of striving, found no audience. He was stunned. He could not understand how something so clearly true and important could be ignored. He blamed the academic establishment, the dominance of mediocrities, the corruption of philosophy by careerists who cared more about reputation than truth. In 1820, he was offered a position as private dozent at the University of Berlin, an unsalaried lecturer who would earn fees from students who attended his lectures. This was a first step toward an academic career, a chance to build a reputation and perhaps eventually secure a professorship. But Schopenhauer made a disastrous decision. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was the dominant philosopher at Berlin, famous and influential, drawing large crowds to his lectures. Schopenhauer despised Hegel's philosophy, saw it as empty jargon masking trivial ideas. and he decided to schedule his own lectures at exactly the same time as Hegel's. This was either supreme confidence or spectacular foolishness. Schopenhauer believed that students would recognize the superiority of his philosophy and choose his lectures over Hegel's. He was wrong. Almost no students came. Hegel's lecture hall was full. Schopenhauer lectured to a nearly empty room. He tried for 1 semester, then he gave up. He never lectured again. The academic career was over before it began. This failure embittered him for life. He believed he had been rejected not because his philosophy was wrong, but because it was too true, because it stripped away comforting illusions, because it told people what they did not want to hear. The academic world, he concluded, was not interested in truth. It was interested in reputation, fashion, empty system building that sounded impressive without actually saying anything. Hegel, he thought, was the perfect example. Hegel wrote impenetrable prose that seemed profound but was actually meaningless. He built elaborate dialectical systems that explained everything and therefore explained nothing. And the academic world loved it because it gave them something to interpret, to argue about, to build careers on. Schopenhauer wrote clearly. He said what he meant. He believed that philosophy should be accessible to anyone willing to think carefully, not hidden behind jargon that only specialists could decode. This clarity worked against him. If philosophy was easy to understand, how could it be profound? If it did not require years of study to decipher, how could it be important? He spent the next 30 years watching Hegel dominate German philosophy, while his own work remained almost unknown. A few copies of The World as Will and Representation sold each year, mostly to people who bought it by mistake or out of curiosity. No one engaged with his ideas. No one wrote responses or critiques. It was as if he had not written anything at all. This experience shaped his view of society, of other people, of the nature of truth and recognition. He concluded that truth and recognition were not correlated, that most people were incapable of recognizing truth when they saw it, that the crowd was always wrong, that fame was more often a sign of mediocrity than of genuine achievement. He developed a theory to explain this. Most people, he argued, are not actually thinking. They are repeating what they have heard, following fashion, deferring to authority. They do not have genuine intellectual interests. They have social interests. They want to fit in, to be respected, to be part of the conversation. So they read what others are reading, praise what others are praising, ignore what others are ignoring. Philosophy, in such an environment, becomes fashion. The dominant philosopher is dominant not because he is right, but because he is fashionable. And anyone who refuses to follow fashion, who insists on thinking for himself, will be ignored. This is why, Schopenhauer concluded, truth is rarely recognized in its own time. It takes decades or centuries for fashion to change, for the crowd to move on, for someone thinking independently to discover work that was ignored when it was new. His own work, he believed, would be recognized eventually, but not in his lifetime, not while the mediocrities controlled the universities and the journals. He was half right. The recognition did come, but not as late as he feared. In his last decade, his work finally found readers, but the decades of obscurity had already done their work. He had learned to live alone, to think alone, to care nothing for the opinions of others. He had learned that solitude was not merely a personal preference, but a necessity for anyone who wanted to think clearly in a world that preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. In 1833, when Arthur Schopenhauer was 45 years old, he settled in Frankfurt. He would live there for the remaining 27 years of his life, in the same apartment, following the same routine, with almost no variation or incident. This is the period when he became the hermit, the solitary philosopher, the man who had given up on society and devoted himself entirely to thought. The routine was rigid. He rose early and wrote until noon, working on revisions and expansions of the world as will and representation, and on collections of essays and aphorisms that would eventually be published as Parerga and Paralipomena. At noon he stopped writing. He played the flute for an hour, badly but with enjoyment. Then he went to lunch at the same restaurant, the Englischer Hof, where he sat at the same table and ordered the same meal. After lunch he walked. Every day for 2 hours, regardless of weather, he walked through Frankfurt with his poodle. The poodle's name was Atman, a Sanskrit word meaning the universal self or soul. When one Atman died, Schopenhauer got another and gave it the same name. He talked to the dog as he walked, addressing it formally as one might address a person, explaining his ideas or complaining about some stupidity he had observed. After the walk, he returned to his apartment and read until evening. He read widely: philosophy, science, literature, periodicals. He read in several languages and kept detailed notes on what he read. Then in the evening, he went to the theatre. Frankfurt had a good theatre, and Schopenhauer attended regularly, preferring comedies and light entertainment to serious drama. Philosophy was serious enough. In the evening, he wanted distraction. After the theatre or reading, he returned home and went to bed. The same routine every day for 27 years. He lived alone. He never married. He had no close relationships. In his youth, he had pursued women occasionally without much success or satisfaction. He had one significant relationship with a young woman named Caroline Richter, who bore a child that was probably his, though he never acknowledged it. The relationship ended badly, with Schopenhauer paying Caroline to leave him alone. Later, he rationalized his solitary life as a philosophical choice. He wrote that he had early renounced the love of women for the love of truth, that romantic relationships were distractions from intellectual work, that the sexual drive was the will's most powerful manifestation, and that anyone seeking liberation from the will had to resist it. Whether this was wisdom or rationalization is unclear, perhaps both. Schopenhauer was not attractive, not socially gifted, not easy to live with. He was critical, pessimistic, demanding. He had high standards and little patience for those who did not meet them. It is likely that he would have been a difficult partner. It is also likely that solitude suited his temperament better than any relationship could have. He did have a few visitors. As his work finally began to find readers in the 1850s, admirers sought him out. A small circle of disciples formed, young men who had read his work and wanted to meet the philosopher. He received them politely, talked with them about philosophy, but did not encourage intimacy. They were readers, not friends. His closest relationship was with his poodle. He talked to the dog constantly, treated it as an equal, seemed to prefer its company to that of humans. When people mocked this, he pointed out that the dog, unlike humans, did not lie, did not pretend, did not perform. The dog was simply itself. This was more than could be said for most people. His apartment was comfortable but austere. He had money from his inheritance and lived well by ordinary standards, but he had no interest in display or luxury. Books lined the walls. A few pieces of furniture, all functional. A bust of Kant. A portrait of Goethe. The flute he played badly. That was all. He had one painting that visitors remarked on, a portrait of his father. It hung in his study where he could see it while he worked. He never spoke about it, but the placement was deliberate. His father had wanted him to be a merchant. Instead, he had become a philosopher. Whether this was triumph or failure, whether his father would have been proud or disappointed, Schopenhauer never knew. The question haunted him. He was not a recluse in the absolute sense. He went out every day, walked through the city, ate in public, attended the theatre, but he was alone in the way that matters. He had no one he could talk to honestly, no one who understood what he was thinking, no one whose company he genuinely enjoyed. He was surrounded by people and utterly isolated. Did this bother him? The evidence is mixed. In his published work, he defended solitude as the condition of intellectual freedom, as preferable to the company of fools, as the mark of a developed inner life. But in his private notes, there are hints of loneliness, of wondering whether he had made the right choices, of imagining what his life might have been if things had gone differently. He wrote that the wise man seeks not pleasure but the absence of pain, that life is suffering and the best we can hope for is to minimize it, that society is a porcupine's dilemma. We need warmth from others, but we hurt each other when we get too close, so we must maintain a careful distance. This was not merely abstract philosophy, it was the rationalization of a life. Schopenhauer had been hurt by people, by his mother's rejection, by the academic world's indifference, by Caroline's demands, by the general stupidity and malice he saw everywhere. So he withdrew. He built a life that required nothing from others, that could not be disrupted by others, that was entirely under his control. Was this wisdom or retreat? He would have said wisdom, that he had seen through the illusions of society, recognized that most people were not worth knowing, and made his peace with solitude. That he had cultivated an inner life rich enough that he did not need external stimulation. That he had achieved what most people never achieve, the capacity to be himself without reference to others. But it cost him. The routine that never varied was also a kind of prison. The apartment he never left was also a cell. The solitude he defended was also an isolation he had not entirely chosen. His father's suicide, his mother's rejection, the academic world's indifference, his own difficult personality, these had conspired to make solitude not merely preferable, but necessary. In 1851, when Schopenhauer was 63, his Parerga and Paralipomena was finally published. This collection of essays and aphorisms was more accessible than The World as Will and Representation, written in Schopenhauer's clear aphoristic style, addressing practical questions about how to live. It found readers. Reviews appeared, mostly positive. People began to seek out his earlier work. For the first time in his life, Schopenhauer experienced recognition. He was not famous, not yet, but he was no longer completely ignored. He had readers. People were talking about his ideas. Universities began teaching his work. He was pleased but also bitter. Where had these readers been 30 years earlier? Why had it taken so long? He had been right all along, and the world had finally caught up. But he was now in his 60s. Most of his life had been spent in obscurity. The recognition came too late to change his life, though it did provide satisfaction in his final years. He died on September 21st, 1860, at age 72. He was found sitting in his chair in his apartment, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep. His poodle was beside him. There was no one else. He had lived as he had advised, alone, self-sufficient, depending on no one. Whether this was the life he had wanted or the life circumstances had forced upon him, it was the life he had lived. His legacy was complex. He had produced one of the most powerful philosophical systems of the 19th century, one that would influence Nietzsche, Freud, Einstein, and countless others. But he had lived a life of isolation, bitterness, and unfulfilled longing for recognition. He had preached the wisdom of solitude while perhaps suffering from it. He had built a philosophy that explained why life was unbearable and showed how one might bear it anyway. To understand Schopenhauer's philosophy of solitude, we must first understand his metaphysics, his account of what the world is and why it has the character it does. Everything else in his philosophy flows from his central insight, announced in the title of his major work, The World as Will and Representation. Schopenhauer began where Kant left off. Kant had argued that we do not perceive the world as it is in itself, but only as it appears to us, structured by the forms of our perception and understanding. Space and time are not features of things in themselves, but forms through which we perceive things. Causality is not a feature of the world, but a category we impose on experience to make it intelligible. This meant that there was a fundamental distinction between the phenomenal world, the world as it appears to us, and the noumenal world, the world as it is in itself. We can know the phenomenal world through science and everyday experience. But the noumenal world, the thing in itself, remains forever beyond our knowledge. Kant thought this was where philosophy had to stop. We cannot know the thing in itself. We can only know appearances. Schopenhauer thought Kant was wrong about this, or at least too cautious. There was, he believed, one way we could know the thing in itself, from the inside through our own willing. When you reach for a glass of water, you perceive this event in two ways. From the outside, observed as a physical event in space and time, it is a movement of your arm caused by neural signals, explicable through the laws of physics and biology. But from the inside, it is an act of will. You want water, and your arm moves. The willing and the movement are not two different things. They are the same thing, experienced from two perspectives. This, Schopenhauer argued, gives us access to the thing in itself. The inner nature of our own body, the reality behind the appearance, is will. Not conscious deliberation or rational choice, but a blind striving, a wanting without reason or purpose. Hunger is not a decision to eat, it is a lack that demands to be filled. Sexual desire is not a choice, it is a drive that seizes us. We do not will because we have reasons. We find reasons to justify what we already will. But Schopenhauer did not stop there. He made a bold metaphysical leap. If the thing in itself in us is will, then the thing in itself in everything is will. The inner nature of reality is not mind or spirit or matter, but blind, purposeless striving. The plant does not grow towards sunlight because it understands photosynthesis. It grows because that is what the will does in plant form. It strives upward. The animal does not hunt because it has decided hunting is good. It hunts because hunger is the will manifesting as lack. The human does not desire because desire serves some rational purpose. The human desires because the human is will, and willing is what the will does. This is not panpsychism, the view that everything is conscious. Schopenhauer did not believe that rocks and plants were conscious. He believed that consciousness was a secondary phenomenon, something that emerged at a certain level of organization, a tool the will developed to serve its purposes. The will itself is not conscious. It does not think or plan or understand. It is blind force, endless striving without goal or meaning. Why does the will strive? There is no reason. The will does not strive in order to achieve something. Striving is what the will is. It is groundless, causeless, purposeless. It simply is, and it manifests as the entire phenomenal world, as matter and energy, as life and growth, as desire and suffering. This is a dark vision. Most philosophers before Schopenhauer had assumed that reality was fundamentally rational, that the world had a purpose or meaning, that existence was ultimately good or at least neutral. Some, like Leibniz, argued that this was the best of all possible worlds, optimized by a benevolent God. Others, like Hegel, believed that history was the gradual unfolding of reason, moving toward ever greater freedom and self-understanding. Schopenhauer believed this was nonsense. There is no benevolent God. There is no rational purpose. There is no progress toward anything better. There is only the will, striving blindly, producing the world as a theatre of endless wanting and frustration. The world is not good. It is not evil. It is not anything that would require purpose or intention. It simply is the manifestation of a blind force that cannot be satisfied because satisfaction is not what it seeks. It seeks only to strive, and striving necessarily involves lack, frustration, suffering. This is why Schopenhauer called his philosophy pessimism, not because he was temperamentally gloomy, though he was, but because he believed the structure of reality was such that suffering was inevitable and fundamental. Optimism was not merely false, it was a failure to see clearly. The world is not set up for our happiness. It is not set up for anything. It is the manifestation of blind will, and we are caught in it, unable to escape except through extraordinary effort. But what does this metaphysics have to do with solitude? Everything. Because if the will is blind striving, and we are manifestations of the will, then we too are blind strivers. We want without knowing why. We desire without reaching satisfaction. We are driven by forces we do not understand and cannot control. And most importantly, we are not truly individuals. Individuality is part of the phenomenal world, part of the representation. Behind the appearance of separate individuals is a single will, manifesting in countless forms but ultimately one. This means that the boundaries between people are illusory. We experience ourselves as separate because space and time, the principles of individuation, are forms of representation, not features of reality itself. At the level of the thing in itself, there is no separation, there is only will. This has two implications for solitude. First, genuine connection between people is impossible at the level of individuality. We are all manifestations of the same will, but we experience ourselves as separate, and that separation is unbridgeable. We are fundamentally alone. Second, the recognition of this fact, the seeing through the illusion of individuality, is the first step toward wisdom. Solitude is not merely the absence of others. It is the recognition that others were always absent in the way we imagined them to be present. Consider desire. To desire something is to lack it. Lack is painful. The pain may be mild, as when you want a cup of coffee, or intense, as when you want food after days of hunger, or water after hours in the desert. But desire is always lack, and lack is always a form of suffering. When desire is satisfied, the lack is removed. You drink the coffee, the hunger is sated, the thirst is quenched. Is this happiness? Schopenhauer said no. It is merely the temporary absence of pain. Satisfaction is negative. It is not the presence of something good, but the absence of something bad. And the absence does not last. Immediately, a new desire arises. You have eaten, so you are no longer hungry, but now you are thirsty, or tired, or bored. There is always a new lack. The will does not rest, it cannot rest. Striving is its nature. To stop striving would be to cease to exist. So life swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. When we desire and lack, we suffer the pain of frustration. When we achieve what we desire, we suffer the boredom of satisfaction. There is no resting place, no state of positive happiness, only the oscillation between two forms of suffering. This is most obvious in intense desires. The person who wants fame suffers from obscurity. If they achieve fame, they discover it does not satisfy. They want more fame, or they want something else. Or they realize that fame itself is empty, and now they have nothing left to want. The person who wants wealth suffers from poverty. If they become wealthy, they discover that wealth does not make them happy. They worry about losing it, or they want more of it, or they realize that having it changes nothing fundamental about their existence. But it is true even of small desires. You want to eat, so you eat. For a moment the wanting stops, but immediately you want something else. You want to be entertained. You want to be productive. You want to be alone. You want company. The wanting never stops. And each wanting is a lack. And each lack is a form of suffering. Schopenhauer was not saying that we never experience moments of pleasure. We do. But pleasure is always the satisfaction of a desire, which means it is always the temporary removal of a pain. And the removal does not last. The pain returns in a new form, and we are back on the pendulum. This is why happiness as a positive state is impossible. If happiness means the presence of something good, independent of the absence of something bad, then happiness does not exist. What we call happiness is always relief from pain. And relief is temporary. The structure is worse than this. Because the will is blind, it does not know what it wants. It strives, but toward what? There is no ultimate goal. Every goal, once achieved, reveals itself as insufficient. The will wanted this thing, and now it has it, and the will immediately wants something else. This is not because we chose the wrong goal, it is because there is no right goal. The will's nature is to strive, not to achieve. Achievement is the end of striving, which is the end of the will, which is impossible. So we are caught in a system we cannot escape. We want because we are will. We suffer because wanting is lack. We achieve what we want and discover that achievement does not end wanting. We are back where we started, only older, more tired, more aware that the cycle will not end. Schopenhauer supported this analysis with examples from life. The young person wants to grow up, to have freedom, to make their own choices. Then they grow up and discover that adulthood is not liberation, but responsibility, burden. The discovery that freedom is not freedom from wanting, but the freedom to realize that wanting never ends. The ambitious person wants success. They work tirelessly, sacrifice everything, finally achieve their goal. And they discover that success is empty, that they are still themselves, still wanting, still unsatisfied. Love is particularly instructive. We see someone and want them. The wanting is intense, painful. We pursue them, obsess over them, believe that if only we could be with them, we would be happy. Perhaps we succeed. We win them. We are together. And what happens? The wanting fades. Familiarity sets in. We take them for granted, or we discover that they are not what we imagined, or we simply lose interest because the will, having achieved what it wanted, moves on to want something else. This is why, Schopenhauer observed, romantic love almost always ends badly. Either it is frustrated and we suffer the pain of unrequited desire, or it is satisfied and we suffer the boredom of possession. The only way for romantic love to maintain its intensity is to remain unconsummated, to exist in a state of permanent longing. But this is not love, it is torture. The same is true of all desires. We want what we do not have. We imagine that having it will satisfy us. We get it and discover that satisfaction was an illusion. The getting might provide temporary relief, but the underlying structure remains. We are will, and will is endless striving. Boredom, then, is not merely the absence of something to do. It is the revelation of the will's nature when external goals are temporarily exhausted. The person who wins the lottery and no longer has to work often becomes miserable. Not because they miss work, but because work was providing structure, goal, a sense of striving towards something. Without it, they face the emptiness that was always there, hidden by the busyness of pursuing the next thing. This is why people fear retirement, fear vacation, fear any extended period without demands or goals. They are afraid of boredom, and they should be. Because boredom is not a trivial discomfort. It is the feeling of existence itself when the will has nothing to strive for. It is the revelation that there is no point, no purpose, no meaning to any of it. We strive to avoid pain, and when we succeed, we discover that the absence of pain is not pleasant, it is empty. So life is unbearable. Not sometimes, not for some people, but fundamentally. The structure of existence as Schopenhauer understood it does not admit of lasting happiness. We are driven by a will we did not choose, toward goals we do not really want, in a cycle that cannot be broken from within. This is not depression, though it sounds like it. Depression is a failure to desire, a collapse of the will. Schopenhauer was not describing that. He was describing normal life, the everyday experience of wanting and achieving and wanting again. He was saying that this experience, which most people take as simply how things are, is actually suffering. That the pendulum is not an occasional problem, but the fundamental structure of existence. And if this is true, then the question becomes, what do we do? How do we live in a world structured this way? Schopenhauer's answer was not despair. It was clear-sightedness. If we understand the structure, we can find ways to mitigate it. Not to escape entirely, that is almost impossible, but to reduce the suffering, to find moments of release, to make life bearable. But before we get to his solutions, we need to understand his analysis of other people, because one of the primary ways humans try to escape the pendulum is through relationships, through society, through the company of others. And Schopenhauer believed this was usually a mistake. Most social interaction, Schopenhauer believed, is theatre. We perform selves for each other. We present versions of ourselves designed to elicit particular responses: admiration, affection, respect, fear. We rarely show what we actually think or feel. We show what we calculate will serve our purposes. This is not usually conscious manipulation, though it can be. Most of the time it is automatic, habitual. We have learned from childhood how to behave in company, how to say things that will be well received, how to hide thoughts that would disturb others, how to present ourselves in ways that make social interaction run smoothly. But this means that social interaction is fundamentally dishonest. We are not connecting with others. We are connecting with performances, with masks. And they are connecting with our performance, our mask. The real person, if there is such a thing, remains hidden. Why do we do this? Because genuine honesty is intolerable in society. If we said what we actually thought, social life would collapse. We think our companion is boring, but we smile and nod. We think our colleague's work is mediocre, but we offer polite praise. We think most conversation is trivial, but we participate in it because the alternative is isolation. Schopenhauer observed that people in company almost never discuss anything important. They talk about the weather, about recent events, about mutual acquaintances. They tell jokes, share gossip, perform the ritual of conversation without any genuine exchange of thoughts or feelings. And they do this because genuine exchange would be unbearable. If we said what we actually thought about most things, we would offend, disturb, alienate. Society requires that we keep our real thoughts to ourselves, but this creates a profound loneliness. We are surrounded by people and entirely alone. We talk constantly and never say anything true. We seek company because we cannot bear solitude, but the company we find is itself a kind of solitude, a being with others that is actually a being apart. Schopenhauer was particularly harsh about the quality of most people's minds. He believed that the vast majority of humans were not capable of genuine thought. They could repeat what they had heard, follow instructions, perform routine tasks, but they could not think independently, could not hold complex ideas, could not distinguish truth from fashion. This was not elitist snobbery, though there was snobbery in it. It was his honest assessment based on observation. Most people, he noted, read nothing serious, think nothing original, pursue no genuine interests. They fill their time with distraction and call it living. Their conversation is empty because their minds are empty. They have nothing to say because they have nothing to think. And these are the people we are supposed to seek out for company? These are the people whose presence is supposed to relieve our loneliness? Schopenhauer thought this was absurd. Loneliness among such people was not a problem. It was a sign of good judgment. He articulated what he called the porcupine's dilemma. On a cold winter day, porcupines huddle together for warmth, but as they get close, their quills prick each other, causing pain. So they move apart. But then they are cold again. They oscillate between the pain of proximity and the discomfort of distance, never finding a stable equilibrium. Humans, Schopenhauer said, are like this with each other. We need something from others: warmth, recognition, connection. But when we get close, we hurt each other. We make demands, impose expectations, intrude on each other's freedom. We bore each other, annoy each other, disappoint each other. So we pull back, but in isolation we feel the lack. We are social animals, he acknowledged, but we are also fundamentally solitary. There is no resolution to this dilemma, only a constant negotiation of distance. The solution, Schopenhauer believed, was to maintain what he called a moderate distance. Not too close, where we hurt each other and lose our freedom. Not too far, where we lose all warmth. But finding this distance is difficult, and most people cannot manage it. They are either clinging, demanding constant contact and reassurance, or they are cold, withdrawn, unable to connect at all. But there is a deeper problem. Even at the ideal distance, what do we actually get from others? Schopenhauer's answer was, not much. The best company, he wrote, is that which we can leave at any moment without consequence. The best friendship is that which demands nothing. The best relationship is that which does not intrude on our solitude. This sounds like no relationship at all, and perhaps that was his point. He believed that most of what passes for relationship is actually mutual use. We seek company not because we genuinely care about the other person, but because their presence serves our purposes. They distract us from boredom. They reflect back a flattering image of ourselves. They provide practical assistance, or social status, or sexual gratification. Remove these utilities and the relationship dissolves. True relationships, relationships based on genuine understanding and affection rather than mutual use, are extremely rare. Schopenhauer believed he had never experienced one. He had acquaintances, people who sought him out because they admired his work or found him useful. But he had no friends in the deep sense, no one who knew him fully and accepted him anyway, no one whose company he genuinely preferred to his own. And he thought this was normal. Most people, he observed, do not have genuine friends either. They have people they spend time with, people they call friends, people they depend on in various ways. But the relationships are shallow, based on convenience or habit, rather than deep connection. If circumstances changed, if one person moved away or changed social position, the relationship would end without much regret on either side. So other people offer little genuine value. They provide temporary distraction from boredom, but at the cost of performance, of hiding oneself, of enduring stupidity and malice. They provide the illusion of connection, but not actual connection, because actual connection requires both people to be capable of depth, honesty, and sustained attention, qualities that Schopenhauer believed were extremely rare. The conclusion was clear. For anyone with a developed inner life, solitude is preferable to the company of most people. Not because solitude is pleasant in itself, Schopenhauer did not romanticize being alone, but because the alternative is worse. Bad company is worse than no company, and most company is bad. This was not a counsel of absolute isolation. Schopenhauer acknowledged that some contact with others was necessary and occasionally valuable, but he believed that such contact should be limited, carefully managed, and never allowed to intrude on the essential solitude that is the condition of clear thought and genuine self-knowledge. The person who cannot be alone, who constantly seeks company, who is anxious and uncomfortable when not with others, is revealing something about themselves. They are revealing that they have nothing inside, that their mind is empty and cannot bear to be left alone with itself, that they need others not for connection but for distraction, for escape from the void within. Why do people flee solitude? Schopenhauer's answer was precise and unsparing, because they cannot bear their own company, and they cannot bear their own company because they have nothing within. Their minds are empty, their thoughts trivial, their interests superficial. When external stimulation is removed, what remains is a void, and the void is unbearable. Boredom is the name we give to this experience of inner emptiness. It is not merely the absence of something to do. It is the feeling that arises when we are thrown back on our own resources and discover that we have no resources, that there is nothing there, no self-worth inhabiting, no thoughts worth thinking, no interests worth pursuing. This is why, Schopenhauer observed, people go to such extraordinary lengths to avoid boredom. They fill every moment with activity, stimulation, distraction. They work long hours not because they love their work, but because work prevents them from facing themselves. They watch television, scroll through social media, play games, consume content constantly. Anything to keep the mind occupied, to prevent the silence in which the void would reveal itself. But the frantic avoidance of boredom reveals the problem it is trying to solve. If the mind were full, if there were genuine interests and thoughts worth attending to, boredom would not be a threat. The person with rich inner resources is never bored. They always have something to think about, something to explore, some question to pursue. They welcome solitude because solitude is the condition under which they can finally attend to their thoughts without interruption. Schopenhauer gave the example of the lottery winner or the person who retires after a career. Often such people become miserable. They have won the supposed goal, freedom from necessity, time to do whatever they want, but they discover that without external demands, they have nothing to do. They thought work was a burden they would be happy to escape, but work was providing structure, purpose, the sense of striving towards something. Without it, they face the emptiness that was always there, hidden by the busyness of daily life. This is why many retired people die soon after retirement, not merely because they are old, but because they lose the structure that was holding them together. They face their own company for the first time in decades and discover they have nothing to offer themselves. The emptiness is intolerable, and they collapse into depression, illness, death. The same is true of anyone who achieves a major goal and then finds themselves without direction. The student who finishes school, the athlete who wins the championship, the entrepreneur who sells their company, they achieve what they were striving for and then discover that the striving was the only thing giving their life meaning. Without it, they are lost. They become depressed, restless, dissatisfied. They look for new goals, new projects, new ways to fill the void. But the void remains because the void is them. Boredom, then, is not a trivial problem. It is the existential problem. It is the revelation of what we are when all external props are removed. And most people, Schopenhauer believed, cannot face this revelation. They will do anything to avoid it. This is why entertainment has become such a massive industry. People need constant distraction. They need something, anything, to occupy their attention, and prevent them from being alone with their thoughts. They pay for this distraction, sometimes enormous amounts. They organize their lives around it. They become anxious if they might be bored for even a few minutes. But the constant need for entertainment is itself evidence of inner poverty. The person who always needs to be entertained has no capacity for self-entertainment. They have no resources within. They are entirely dependent on external stimulation for any sense of satisfaction or meaning. Schopenhauer contrasted this with the person who has cultivated inner resources. Such a person has thoughts worth thinking, interests worth pursuing, questions worth exploring. They have read widely, thought carefully, developed genuine curiosities that do not require external reinforcement. They can sit in a room alone for hours and not be bored because their mind is active, working on problems, making connections, pursuing lines of thought. This capacity is not innate. It must be cultivated. It requires education in the deep sense, not merely the accumulation of information, but the development of intellectual interests, the training of attention, the habit of sustained thought. It requires reading serious books, engaging with difficult ideas, thinking about questions that have no easy answers. Most education, Schopenhauer believed, does not provide this. It teaches information, skills, practical knowledge. But it does not teach how to think, how to sustain attention, how to pursue questions for their own sake rather than for some external reward. So most people emerge from education with no real intellectual resources. They have learned how to do specific things, but they have not learned how to be alone with themselves. The result is a population that cannot tolerate solitude, that needs constant distraction, that organizes life around avoiding boredom. And this population looks at those who can tolerate solitude with suspicion or pity. The person who prefers to be alone must be lonely, they think, must be missing out, must be unhappy. But Schopenhauer believed the reverse was true. The person who cannot be alone is the one who is missing out. They are missing the only condition under which genuine thought is possible, under which one can know oneself, under which one can develop the inner life that makes human existence bearable. Solitude is not for everyone. Schopenhauer acknowledged this. Some people are constitutionally social, find genuine pleasure in company, have minds that work best in interaction with others. But such people are rare. Most people who flee solitude are not fleeing it because they love society, but because they fear themselves. They fear the silence, the emptiness, the void that reveals itself when external noise is removed. And this fear is rational. If you have nothing inside, solitude is unbearable. You are faced with yourself and discover there is nothing there. You are bored not because you have nothing to do, but because you are nothing to be. The person who has not cultivated an inner life literally has no self to be alone with. This is the tragedy of the modern condition, as Schopenhauer saw it. We have created a society of endless distraction, and we have populated it with people who have no inner resources. We have taught people to work, consume, perform, but not to think, reflect, or simply be. And the result is a population that is terrified of silence, of solitude, of any moment when they might be forced to confront themselves. But there is an alternative, the cultivation of the inner life, the development of thoughts, interests, capacities for contemplation that make solitude not merely bearable, but preferable. This is the work, and it is hard work. It requires discipline, patience, sustained effort over years. But it is the only work that truly matters, because it is the only work that makes life as such bearable. Schopenhauer's philosophy offers no easy comfort here. He did not promise that if you develop inner resources, you will be happy. He promised only that you will be able to bear your own company, that you will not need to flee from yourself, that solitude will become refuge rather than prison. This is cold comfort, but it is comfort nonetheless. Schopenhauer's metaphysics was unrelenting. The will is blind striving, life is suffering, social connection is mostly illusion, and boredom reveals the emptiness within. But he did not counsel despair. He found ways through, not permanent escape from the structure of existence, but temporary release, moments when suffering ceased and something like peace became possible. The first and most accessible of these ways was art. In aesthetic experience, Schopenhauer believed the will is momentarily silenced. We cease to desire, we stop striving, we simply perceive, and in that perception we are briefly free. Consider looking at a painting, not glancing at it in passing, not evaluating it as a commodity or status symbol, but genuinely attending to it. You stand before it and let it hold your attention. The colours, the forms, the relationships between elements, the way light is suggested, the mood that emerges from the composition. You take it all in without wanting anything from it. You are not using the painting. You are simply perceiving it. In that moment, Schopenhauer said, you cease to be an individual will, striving for particular goals. You become what he called the pure subject of knowing. You are no longer a person with desires, fears, needs. You are simply awareness, consciousness without content, a clear mirror reflecting what is before you. And what you perceive is not the painting as a particular object in space and time, but the idea that the painting expresses. By idea, Schopenhauer meant something close to Plato's forms, the universal pattern or essence that particular things instantiate. The painting shows particular colours and shapes, but what you perceive in genuine aesthetic contemplation is something universal: beauty, sorrow, tension, harmony that transcends the particular work. This sounds abstract, but the experience is familiar. When you are genuinely absorbed in a work of art, you lose track of time. Your personal concerns fall away. You forget yourself. You are not thinking about what you need to do later or what happened earlier. You are simply there, with the work, in a state of complete attention. This is what Schopenhauer meant by the silencing of the will. The will is what drives us forward in time, what makes us plan and worry and desire. But in aesthetic contemplation, time stops. We are not moving toward anything. We are simply here, now, perceiving. And this is relief. For a moment we escape the pendulum of pain and boredom. We are not desiring and therefore not suffering the pain of lack. We are not satisfied with nothing to strive for and therefore not suffering boredom. We are in a third state, entirely outside the pendulum, the state of contemplation, where suffering temporarily ceases. All genuine art, Schopenhauer believed, offers this possibility. Painting, sculpture, poetry, drama, each in its own way, arrests the will and allows contemplation. The beautiful object is the object that pulls us out of our usual state of striving and holds us in a state of perception. But Schopenhauer believed music was special. Music, he argued, was not like the other arts. Painting represents ideas, universal patterns, but music does not represent anything external to itself. Music is not a copy of ideas, but a direct copy of the will itself. This was a strange claim, and Schopenhauer knew it. How could music be a copy of the will if the will is metaphysical reality, not something that could be copied? His answer was that music somehow expresses the inner nature of willing, not as we experience it from inside, as desire and frustration, but as pure form, as structure without content. The bass line in music, moving slowly, suggested to him the inorganic world, solid and stable. The inner voices, moving with moderate complexity, suggested the plant and animal kingdoms, life striving according to fixed patterns. And the melody, the highest voice, moving freely and expressively, suggested human consciousness were made aware of itself. Music, he thought, gives us the structure of reality, the pattern of striving and satisfaction and striving again, but without the suffering that attends actual willing. We hear the will from outside, as pure form, and in that hearing we are both connected to reality and released from having to be caught in it. This is why music moves us so deeply. It is not representing emotions we have or telling stories we can follow. It is giving us direct access to the inner nature of existence itself, but in a mode that does not hurt. We experience the full range of willing, longing, satisfaction, tension, resolution, but as aesthetic object rather than as lived experience. Whether Schopenhauer's metaphysics of music is correct is debatable, but his phenomenology of musical experience is accurate. When we are genuinely absorbed in music, we do cease to be ourselves. We are carried along by the movement of sound, our attention entirely occupied, our usual concerns suspended. Time passes without our noticing. We are not bored and we are not suffering. We are simply listening, and in that listening, we are briefly free. Schopenhauer believed this capacity for aesthetic contemplation could be cultivated. Some people had it naturally, he thought. People he called geniuses, though he used the term in a specific technical sense. The genius was not necessarily someone who created great art, but someone who could enter the state of contemplation easily and sustain it for long periods. But even those not naturally gifted could develop this capacity. It required practice, attention, the willingness to slow down and actually look at things rather than merely glancing at them while thinking about something else. It required going to museums, reading poetry, listening to music with full attention rather than as background. It required learning to use art as it was meant to be used, as a doorway out of ordinary consciousness into something higher and clearer. This was not mere aestheticism, the cultivation of refined taste for its own sake. It was a practical technique for reducing suffering. If we can enter the state of aesthetic contemplation regularly, if we can learn to find objects that arrest the will and hold our attention, then we can punctuate the pendulum of pain and boredom with moments of release. The suffering does not end permanently, but it is interrupted, and those interruptions make life bearable. For those capable of it, art offers something even more valuable, evidence that there is something in human experience besides suffering. Schopenhauer did not believe life was good overall, but he believed that aesthetic experience was good in itself, not instrumentally good as a means to something else, but intrinsically good, worth having for its own sake. And if such experience is possible, then existence is not purely evil. It contains something genuinely valuable. This was as close as Schopenhauer came to optimism. Art does not redeem the suffering of existence. It does not make life worth living in any grand sense, but it provides moments of genuine peace, genuine release, genuine value. And for a philosophy of pessimism, that is no small thing. The aesthetic experience Schopenhauer described in relation to art was not limited to art. It was a mode of consciousness that could be cultivated and directed toward anything: nature, ideas, even everyday objects if one looked at them rightly. This was the deeper significance of aesthetic contemplation. It revealed a capacity we possess to step outside the will, to become something other than what we ordinarily are. Schopenhauer called this state the pure subject of knowing. In our usual condition, we are not pure subjects. We are individuals with particular needs, desires, fears, histories. We perceive the world not as it is, but as it relates to us. We see food as something to eat, people as potential allies or threats, objects as useful or useless. Our perception is always instrumental, always filtered through the question, how does this serve or threaten my purposes? This is normal consciousness. This is how we must function to survive in the world. The hungry person cannot stand before food in pure contemplation. They must eat. The threatened person cannot admire the beauty of the predator. They must flee or fight. Our ordinary consciousness is shaped by the will, by our needs and drives, and this is as it should be. But we are also capable of another mode. When we genuinely attend to something without wanting anything from it, without asking how it serves our purposes, we enter a different state. We cease to be individuals and become what Schopenhauer called the pure subject of knowing. Consciousness without personal content, awareness without agenda. In this state, we do not perceive things as they relate to us, but as they are in themselves. We do not see the tree as firewood or shade or obstacle, but simply as tree, as the idea of tree made manifest in this particular instance. We do not see the person as friend or enemy or stranger, but as human, as consciousness confronting consciousness, as another manifestation of the same will that we are. This is difficult to sustain. Our ordinary consciousness constantly reasserts itself. We slip back into wanting, evaluating, relating everything to ourselves. But with practice, we can learn to enter this state more easily and maintain it for longer periods. Schopenhauer believed this capacity was what distinguished humans from animals. Animals are entirely caught in willing. They perceive only what serves their immediate needs. The lion sees the gazelle as food, nothing more. The lion cannot stand back and contemplate the gazelle as a beautiful creature with its own existence, independent of being eaten. But humans can. We can step back from our immediate needs and perceive things disinterestedly. We can think about questions that have no practical relevance to our survival. We can contemplate ideas, patterns, relationships that have no bearing on whether we eat or reproduce or avoid danger. This capacity is what makes us capable of philosophy, of science, of art, of all activities that involve seeing beyond immediate utility to something universal. But this capacity varies enormously between individuals. Some people, Schopenhauer observed, never develop it at all. They remain entirely caught in instrumental consciousness, seeing everything in terms of how it affects them. Their thoughts are always about their own situation, their own needs, their own concerns. They cannot think about anything abstractly or generally because they cannot escape their own perspective. Such people, Schopenhauer believed, have very little inner life. They can think about practical matters but not about ideas. They can follow instructions but not pursue questions. They can function in the world but they cannot reflect on the world. And because they cannot escape their own immediate perspective, they are trapped in it. They cannot find relief from the will because they cannot step outside willing long enough to see anything else. But those who have developed the capacity for contemplation have access to something invaluable: the ability to be interested in things for their own sake rather than for what they provide. And interest is the cure for boredom. The person with genuine interests is never bored because there is always something to think about, something to explore, some question to pursue. This is what it means to have a rich inner life. Not that one has many desires or busy thoughts or elaborate fantasies, but that one has genuine intellectual and aesthetic interests that can occupy attention without exhausting themselves. The person who is interested in history can think about historical questions indefinitely. The person who is interested in mathematics can explore mathematical problems without end. The person who is interested in philosophy can contemplate philosophical questions for a lifetime without running out of material. These interests do not depend on external circumstances. You do not need books or teachers or equipment to think about ideas. You need only your own mind and the capacity to sustain attention. This is why the cultivated person is never entirely at the mercy of circumstance. Even in prison, even in poverty, even in isolation, they have their thoughts. They can enter the state of contemplation and find there a refuge from external suffering. Schopenhauer himself was proof of this. He spent decades in obscurity, ignored by the academic world, with almost no one to talk to about what he was thinking. But he was never bored. He had his work, his books, his thoughts. He could sit in his apartment and think for hours without needing anything external to occupy him. His inner life was rich enough that solitude was not deprivation, but opportunity. This is what he meant when he said that the capacity to be alone was the mark of intellectual and spiritual development. It was not about personality or social preference. It was about having cultivated the inner resources that make solitude bearable, and more than bearable, actually preferable to most social interaction, because solitude is the condition under which contemplation is possible without interruption. The practical question, then, is how to develop this capacity. Schopenhauer's answer was education in the true sense, the cultivation of genuine interests through exposure to great art, serious literature, important ideas. Not education as job training or credential acquisition, but education as the development of the mind itself. This requires reading, not reading for information or entertainment, but reading works that challenge and expand the mind. Philosophy, history, serious fiction, poetry, works that demand sustained attention and repay it with genuine insight. It requires thinking about what one reads, pursuing questions that arise, making connections between ideas. It also requires practice in attention itself. We live in an age of constant distraction, where attention is fragmented, where we are always looking at something but rarely seeing anything. The development of contemplative capacity requires learning to focus, to sustain attention on a single object or idea for extended periods, to resist the pull of distraction. Schopenhauer would have despised social media, notifications, the entire apparatus of modern technology designed to fragment attention and keep us in a state of shallow engagement with everything and deep engagement with nothing. He believed that the ability to think required long stretches of uninterrupted time, and that most people had trained themselves to be unable to tolerate such time. But for those willing to do the work, the reward is genuine. The person who has developed the capacity for contemplation has access to a mode of consciousness in which suffering temporarily ceases. They can enter this state deliberately, as a practice, a refuge from the pendulum of pain and boredom. And they can live in such a way that solitude becomes not a burden to be endured, but an opportunity to be seized, the condition under which they are most fully themselves. But aesthetic contemplation, however valuable, was only temporary. The beautiful object held our attention for a time, the will was silenced, and we found relief. But then the work ended, or our attention flagged, and we returned to ordinary consciousness. We were hungry again, tired again, wanting again. The pendulum resumed its swing. Schopenhauer saw this clearly. Art was not salvation, it was respite. It proved that release from the will was possible, but it did not provide permanent release. For that, something more radical was required. His answer was the denial of the will itself, not temporary silencing, but permanent renunciation. Not stepping aside from willing for moments, but turning away from it entirely. This was, he believed, the only true solution to the problem of suffering, and also the most difficult, perhaps impossible, for most people to achieve. What did he mean by denial of the will? Not suicide. Suicide was an act of will against life, still caught in willing, still expressing the will's dissatisfaction with its current manifestation. The person who kills themselves is saying, I want different circumstances, and since I cannot have them, I will destroy this life. but wanting different circumstances is still wanting. Suicide is the will turning against itself, but it is not the denial of will. It is will frustrated to the point of self-destruction. The denial of the will meant something different, the gradual cessation of wanting itself. Not the killing of the body, but the starvation of desire. The turning away from all goals, all strivings, all attachments to outcomes. The cultivation of a state in which one no longer willed anything, no longer wanted anything, no longer sought anything. This was not depression, which is the collapse of the ability to want. It was the deliberate renunciation of wanting even while the capacity remained. The depressed person cannot desire. They have lost the energy or motivation to pursue goals. But the person who denies the will can desire. They simply choose not to. They see through desire, recognize it as the source of suffering, and turn away from it. Schopenhauer found his models in religious ascetics, Christian saints who renounced the world, Hindu sannyasi who abandoned all possessions and attachments, Buddhist monks who sought the extinction of desire. He was not religious in any conventional sense. He believed organized religion was mostly superstition, but he saw in these figures something philosophically important. They had recognized what he had recognized, that existence is suffering, that suffering comes from willing, and that the only escape is to stop willing. The stages of this denial were clear. First came the recognition that individuality is illusion. At the level of representation, we appear to be separate individuals, each with our own interests that conflict with others. But at the level of the thing in itself, we are all manifestations of the same will. The boundaries between us are not real. What hurts you hurts me, because at the deepest level, you and I are the same. This recognition, if truly grasped, produces compassion. Not as moral sentiment or emotional sympathy, but as metaphysical insight. I see your suffering and recognize it as my suffering because we are not truly separate. The violence I do to you is violence I do to myself. The distinction between self-interest and other interest collapses. Schopenhauer believed compassion was the only genuine moral motivation. All other supposed moral motivations, duty, divine command, social contract, were either disguised self-interest or empty abstractions. But compassion was real because it was rooted in the truth about reality. When I act compassionately, I am acting on the recognition that the boundaries between us are illusory. But compassion alone was not the denial of the will. It was a step toward it, a recognition that shifted perspective. But true denial required going further, renouncing not just harm to others, but the entire project of striving for anything. This meant renouncing pleasure, comfort, achievement, reputation, relationships, all the things humans ordinarily pursue. Not because these things were evil, but because pursuit itself was the problem. Every desire, even desire for good things, was a manifestation of the will, and every manifestation of the will was suffering because the will was blind striving that could never be satisfied. The person who denied the will lived simply, ascetically. They ate what was necessary to sustain life, but took no pleasure in food. They maintained the body but cared nothing for its appearance or comfort. They interacted with others when necessary but formed no attachments. They performed whatever actions were required but without any investment in outcomes. They lived in the world but were not of it, going through the motions of life while inwardly detached from everything. This sounds like a living death, and in a sense it was. Schopenhauer acknowledged this. The person who successfully denied the will ceased to be a person in the ordinary sense. They had no individuality, no personality, no particular character. They were consciousness without content, awareness without agenda, existence without striving. But this was not death. death was the end of the body, which meant nothing philosophically because the will continued in other forms. The denial of the will was something different, the turning away from willing while still alive, the achievement of a state that Buddhists called nirvana and Christians called salvation, and Schopenhauer called the peace that passes all understanding. He described this state as a kind of nothingness, but nothingness relative to the world of willing, not absolute nothingness. To those still caught in willing, the person who had denied the will appeared to have nothing, to be nothing. But from the inside, the experience was different, a profound peace, a freedom from all striving, a release from the pendulum of pain and boredom. Schopenhauer was honest about the difficulty of achieving this state. He himself had not achieved it. He admitted this explicitly. He was too attached to his comforts, his routine, his books, his work. He had seen the path but had not walked it to its end. He was a philosopher of renunciation who could not fully renounce. This admission is important. Schopenhauer was not preaching something he had achieved and expecting others to follow. He was describing what he believed to be the logical conclusion of his metaphysics, the only true solution to the problem of suffering, while acknowledging that it was almost impossibly difficult and perhaps not achievable for most people. He also acknowledged that the denial of the will was not something that could be achieved through effort. This was the paradox. If you tried to deny the will, your trying was itself an act of will. You could not will yourself to stop willing. The denial had to come not through striving, but through a kind of grace, a spontaneous turning away that arose not from effort, but from profound insight into the nature of existence. This made the denial of the will an odd kind of goal. It was the highest possibility, the complete escape from suffering. But it could not be pursued like ordinary goals. All you could do was understand the problem clearly, live as ethically as possible by developing compassion, cultivate the capacity for contemplation that showed you what life without willing might be like, and wait for the final turning that might or might not come. For most people, this was not a realistic path. Schopenhauer understood this. Most people would remain caught in willing until death. But understanding the path, even without walking it completely, could still reduce suffering. One could limit desires, develop inner resources, maintain compassion, find moments of release through contemplation. This was not liberation, but it was mitigation. It was a way to make life bearable, even if one could not escape it entirely. And for those few who might actually achieve the denial of the will, Schopenhauer's philosophy provided a map. He had thought through the metaphysics, traced the path, described what lay at the end. He could not walk it himself, but perhaps others could. And if they did, they would find what saints and sages had found before. A peace that the world could not give and could not take away, the only genuine escape from the suffering that is existence. Schopenhauer's ultimate answer to suffering was radical, the complete denial of the will, the renunciation of all striving, the life of the ascetic who had turned away from the world entirely. But he knew this was not for everyone. It was perhaps not for anyone except those rare individuals who possessed both the insight to see clearly and the constitution to act on what they saw. For the rest of us, those who would remain in the world, who would continue to will and strive and suffer, he offered something different, practical wisdom. Not liberation but mitigation. Not escape from the pendulum, but advice for reducing its amplitude, for making life more bearable while acknowledging that it would never be truly good. This practical wisdom was collected in his Aphorisms on the Wisdom of Life, published in 1851 as part of Parerga and Paralipomena. He was 63 when he wrote it, looking back on his life, offering advice to those who had to live as he had lived, in the world, not free from it. He began with a crucial distinction. What people usually called wisdom of life was actually advice for being successful, happy, fulfilled. But true wisdom, Schopenhauer said, recognized that lasting happiness was impossible given the structure of existence. The best one could hope for was not positive happiness, but the absence of acute suffering, not joy, but tolerable existence, not fulfillment, but endurance. This sounds grim, but it was actually liberating. If you stopped chasing impossible goals like lasting happiness, you could focus on achievable ones like reducing suffering. If you accepted that life was fundamentally characterized by dissatisfaction, you could stop blaming yourself when you felt dissatisfied and instead work on practical strategies for making dissatisfaction less acute. The first principle was health. Schopenhauer believed that physical health was the foundation of whatever satisfaction was available to us. When the body was healthy, pain was absent, and absence of pain was the closest we came to positive well-being. When the body was unhealthy, no amount of wealth or success or pleasure could compensate. Health was not sufficient for tolerable existence, but it was necessary. This meant taking care of the body, exercise, adequate sleep, moderation in food and drink. Schopenhauer followed his own advice here, walking daily, eating simply, maintaining routines that supported physical health. He was not an athlete or health enthusiast, but he understood that the body's condition affected everything else. An unhealthy body was another source of suffering added to those inherent in existence itself. The second principle was limiting desires. The fewer things you needed to be satisfied, the less you could be hurt. Every desire was a potential source of suffering, either the pain of not having what you wanted or the boredom of having it. The solution was not to satisfy more desires, but to have fewer desires to satisfy. This did not mean living in poverty or discomfort. Schopenhauer lived comfortably on his inheritance and saw no virtue in unnecessary suffering, but it meant not being attached to comforts, not needing luxuries, not defining your well-being in terms of possessions or status or achievements that depended on external circumstances. The person who needed little could tolerate any circumstances. The person who needed much was vulnerable to any change in fortune. Better to cultivate simplicity, to find satisfaction in what was readily available, to avoid expensive tastes and elaborate requirements, not as asceticism, but as practical strategy for reducing vulnerability to suffering. The third principle was solitude. We have already discussed this at length, but it was central to Schopenhauer's practical wisdom. Most people, he observed, were not worth knowing. Their company was exhausting, their conversation trivial, their demands burdensome. Solitude was not merely tolerable, it was preferable to bad company, and most company was bad. This did not mean complete isolation. Some contact with others was necessary and occasionally valuable, but it should be limited, carefully chosen, and never allowed to become necessary for one's sense of well-being. The person who needed constant company was vulnerable to loneliness when company was unavailable. The person who was comfortable alone was never lonely because they always had their own company, and their own company was better than most people's. The fourth principle was work. Schopenhauer believed that meaningful work, work that engaged the mind and required sustained attention, was one of the few sources of satisfaction available to humans. Not because work produced anything valuable, all products were ultimately futile given the nature of existence, but because work occupied the will, gave it direction, prevented the boredom that arose from having nothing to strive for. The best work was intellectual work, work that engaged the mind in thinking about ideas, solving problems, creating understanding. But any work that required skill and attention was valuable in this sense. The craftsman shaping wood, the gardener tending plants, the musician practicing scales, All were engaged in activity that prevented boredom while not depending on outcomes beyond their control. The worst condition was to have nothing to do and no capacity to do anything. This was the condition of the lottery winner who had never developed interests, the retired person who had no hobbies, the wealthy person who had servants to do everything and therefore nothing to occupy themselves. Such people were condemned to boredom without the resources to escape it. The fifth principle was independence. Schopenhauer valued above all the freedom to live according to his own judgment without having to defer to others' opinions or accommodate others' expectations. This was why financial independence was so important to him. It freed him from having to make his work marketable, from having to please employers or audiences or patrons. But independence was not merely financial. It was psychological and intellectual. It meant not caring what others thought, not seeking approval or recognition, not defining your worth in terms of how others saw you. It meant being content to be misunderstood, ignored, even despised, if that was the price of thinking clearly and saying what you believed to be true. This independence was difficult to achieve. Humans are social animals, and we care deeply about others' opinions. The desire for recognition, approval, status was powerful and almost impossible to eliminate entirely, but it could be reduced. One could learn to care less, to find satisfaction in one's own judgment rather than others, to accept that most people would not understand, and that their failure to understand said more about them than about you. The sixth principle was cultivating inner resources. We have discussed this extensively, but it was the foundation of all Schopenhauer's practical wisdom. The person with a rich inner life could tolerate any external circumstances. The person with nothing inside was at the mercy of circumstance, always dependent on external stimulation to escape boredom. Inner resources meant genuine interests, intellectual and aesthetic, that could occupy attention indefinitely. It meant reading, thinking, contemplating, pursuing questions for their own sake. It meant developing the capacity to be interested in things that most people found boring, because interest was subjective and could be cultivated through attention and practice. This was the work of a lifetime. One did not wake up one morning with a rich inner life. One built it gradually through consistent effort, through reading and thinking and practicing attention. But the investment repaid itself many times over. The person with inner resources was never bored, never entirely dependent on others, never at the mercy of circumstance. They had a refuge that could not be taken away. These principles were not revolutionary. Much of Schopenhauer's practical wisdom echoed Stoic philosophy, Buddhist teaching, even common sense. But he grounded them in his metaphysics, showing why they worked, what they were protecting against, how they related to the fundamental structure of existence. And he was honest about their limits. Following these principles would not make you happy. It would not eliminate suffering. It would not answer the deep questions about meaning and purpose. It would simply make life more bearable. It would reduce the amplitude of the pendulum, limit your vulnerability to circumstance, provide some stability in an existence that was fundamentally unstable. This was wisdom for those who remained in the world, not the highest wisdom that belonged to the saints who renounced everything, but wisdom enough for those of us who lacked the constitution or circumstances for complete renunciation. It was cold comfort, advice for endurance rather than flourishing, but for anyone who had already seen through the cheerful lies about life being fundamentally good, it was the only honest comfort available. The first and most obvious reward is freedom from performance. Social life is theatre. We present versions of ourselves designed to elicit particular responses. We say what is expected, hide what would disturb, perform the role that circumstances demand. This is exhausting. It is also dishonest, though unavoidably so. Society requires performance. Without it, social interaction collapses into conflict or confusion. In solitude, the performance can end. You do not need to present any particular face to anyone. You do not need to be impressive or likable or even coherent. You can simply be whatever you are in that moment, without the work of making yourself acceptable to others. This freedom is not trivial. Most people spend their entire lives performing, so consistently that they lose track of what they are beneath the performance. They become their social role. The mask becomes the face, and they never discover what they might have been if they had been free to be themselves. Solitude offers the possibility of that discovery. Not immediately. Unmasking is difficult, and most people remain performative even when alone, rehearsing conversations, imagining audiences. But with time and practice, solitude can strip away the social self and reveal whatever is beneath. For some people there is nothing beneath, and solitude becomes unbearable. But for others, there is something. A self that was hidden, thoughts that were suppressed, possibilities that were closed off by the demands of social performance. The second reward is time for thought. Genuine thinking requires extended periods of uninterrupted time. You cannot think deeply about complex questions in 5-minute intervals between social obligations. You need hours, days, the ability to hold a problem in mind and return to it repeatedly, to explore different approaches, to make connections that only emerge slowly. Schopenhauer spent his mornings writing, 4 hours every day undisturbed. This was not inspiration striking randomly. It was disciplined, consistent work made possible by the protection of solitude. If he had been socially active, accepting invitations, maintaining relationships, responding to others' demands, he could not have produced what he produced. This is true for anyone engaged in difficult intellectual or creative work. Social life fragments attention. Each interaction demands a shift in focus, a recalibration of thought to accommodate others' concerns. These shifts are costly. They break flow, scatter attention, make it impossible to maintain the sustained focus that deep work requires. Solitude protects against this fragmentation. It creates space for sustained attention, for the kind of thinking that actually discovers something new rather than merely rearranging what was already known. The third reward is protection from stupidity and malice. Schopenhauer had a dark view of most people, but it was not entirely wrong. Most people are not particularly intelligent. Most conversation is trivial. Most social interaction is either mutually beneficial theatre or subtle conflict. And a significant minority of people are actively malicious, taking pleasure in harming others or at least caring nothing for others' well-being. Time spent with such people is worse than time wasted. It is time spent being diminished, exposed to stupidity that drags down your own thinking, malice that hurts even when you know it is malice. The social obligation to be polite, to give everyone a chance, to assume good faith often means subjecting yourself to people who do not deserve your time or attention. Solitude protects against this. You cannot be bored by someone who is not there. You cannot be hurt by malice that does not reach you. You cannot have your thinking degraded by exposure to stupidity if you control who and what you expose yourself to. This sounds misanthropic, and it is. But misanthropy is sometimes realistic. Not everyone is worth knowing. Not all company is better than no company. And the person who recognizes this and chooses solitude over bad company is not failing to connect but succeeding at discrimination. The fourth reward is the cultivation of inner resources. We have discussed this at length, but it is worth emphasizing here. Solitude is the condition under which the inner life develops. You cannot build a rich intellectual and aesthetic life while constantly responding to external demands. You need time alone, time to read without interruption, time to think without having to explain or justify your thoughts to anyone, time to pursue interests that others might find strange or boring. The person who has cultivated inner resources through solitude has achieved something rare and valuable: independence from external circumstance. Their well-being does not depend on having the right company or the right entertainment or the right stimulation. They carry their satisfaction within them. They can be content anywhere, in any circumstances, because they have something inside that circumstances cannot touch. This is not invulnerability. External circumstances can still cause suffering, poverty, illness, loss, injustice. But the person with inner resources is less vulnerable than the person with none. They have a foundation that remains even when external supports are removed. The fifth reward is authenticity. This is a dangerous word, often used loosely, but Schopenhauer meant something specific: living according to your own nature rather than according to others' expectations. Most people never discover their own nature because they spend their entire lives responding to external demands. They become what parents wanted, what society rewarded, what circumstances required. They never ask what they themselves wanted or who they themselves might have been without these pressures. Solitude creates space for that question. Removed from constant social reinforcement, you can begin to notice what you actually think, what you actually value, what you actually want to do with your time. These may not be what you thought, valued, or wanted. You may have been performing even for yourself. This discovery can be uncomfortable. You may discover that you are stranger than you believed, that your interests are more unusual, that your values are less conventional. But it is better to know this than to live your entire life as someone else, never discovering who you might have been. The sixth reward is peace, not happiness. Schopenhauer did not believe in happiness, but something closer to what the Stoics called ataraxia, or what Buddhists called equanimity, a state of not being tossed about by circumstances, of having achieved some stability of mind that does not depend on external conditions going well. This peace comes from several sources: from the freedom from social performance, which removes the exhausting work of maintaining appearances; from the protection from stupidity and malice, which removes sources of active harm; from the cultivation of inner resources, which provides satisfaction that does not depend on external circumstances; from the capacity for contemplation, which offers moments of genuine release from the pendulum of pain and boredom. Schopenhauer himself achieved some version of this peace in his later years. He was not happy. He remained pessimistic, critical, often bitter, but he had created a life he could bear, a routine that protected his time and attention, a solitude that was refuge rather than prison. He was not grateful for existence. He continued to believe existence was fundamentally suffering, but he had found a way to exist that was tolerable, even occasionally satisfying. This is what solitude offers to those capable of receiving it: not joy but peace, not fulfillment but endurance, not happiness but the absence of acute suffering. For anyone who has seen through the cheerful lies about life being fundamentally good, this is no small gift. But solitude is not without dangers, and to present it honestly, we must acknowledge what it costs and what can go wrong. The first danger was eccentricity. Without others to provide feedback, to challenge assumptions, to maintain social norms, the solitary person could drift into strange patterns of thought and behavior that made sense from inside but appeared bizarre from outside. Schopenhauer himself was aware of this. He talked to his poodle as if it were a person. He developed elaborate theories about topics that no one cared about. He maintained routines so rigid that any deviation caused distress. These eccentricities were harmless, but they marked him as strange. They created distance between him and others, reinforcing the isolation that produced them. This was a feedback loop. Solitude made you strange. Strangeness made solitude more necessary. Increased solitude made you stranger still. For some people, this mattered little. If you valued your own judgment over others and did not care about social acceptance, eccentricity was no real cost. But for others, becoming strange was a genuine loss. They might want the benefits of solitude without the social costs, but these could not be fully separated. Extended solitude changed you, and the changes made it harder to return to social life even when you might want to. The second danger was rigidity. Solitude allowed you to structure life entirely according to your preferences. You could wake when you wanted, work when you wanted, eat what you wanted, follow routines that suited you perfectly. But this perfect accommodation to your preferences made you less flexible, less able to tolerate deviation, less capable of adapting when circumstances changed. Schopenhauer's routine was so rigid that he became distressed if anything disrupted it. He ate at the same restaurant at the same time every day. He walked the same route. He worked the same hours. This routine supported his productivity and protected his peace, but it also made him fragile. Any change was disruptive. Any demand to adapt was difficult. This rigidity extended to thoughts as well as routines. Without others to challenge your ideas, you could become convinced that your view was the only reasonable one. You could lose the ability to see from other perspectives, to understand why others might disagree, to hold your beliefs lightly enough to revise them if necessary. The social person was constantly forced to adapt, to see things from others' perspectives, to compromise and adjust. This was often exhausting and sometimes dishonest, but it kept them flexible. The solitary person, lacking this constant pressure to adapt, could become rigid in ways that served them poorly when adaptation became necessary. The third danger was lethargy. External demands provided structure, motivation, accountability. Without them, it was easy to drift, to postpone work, to indulge in comfort rather than effort. Schopenhauer's iron discipline protected him against this, but not everyone possessed such discipline. The person who chose solitude to escape demands might discover that without demands they accomplished little. They had imagined that freedom from obligations would allow them to pursue their real interests, to do the work they cared about. But when the freedom arrived, they found that they lacked the internal motivation to do anything. They spent their solitude not in productive work or deep thought, but in passive consumption, distraction, gradual decay of capacities. This was a real danger, not a trivial one. Solitude required internal discipline to replace external discipline. If you could not provide this for yourself, solitude became not freedom, but aimless drift. Days and years passing without producing anything, or developing anything, or learning anything. The fourth danger was disconnection from reality. Other people, however annoying, provided contact with perspectives different from your own. They reminded you that your view was not the only view, that your concerns were not universal concerns, that the world looked different from where they stood. Without this contact, you could lose touch with how others actually thought and felt. You could develop elaborate theories about human nature based entirely on your own experience or on your reading. You could become convinced that everyone was like you, or that everyone who was not like you was defective. You could lose the capacity for empathy not from lack of caring, but from lack of information about what others' experience actually felt like. Schopenhauer exhibited this at times. His views on women were absurd, based more on resentment and selective reading than on actual acquaintance with women as individuals. His theories about human nature were often accurate about certain types of people, intellectual introverts like himself, but wildly wrong about others. He spent so much time alone that he forgot how much variability there was in human experience. The fifth danger was the inability to connect when connection might serve you. Solitude was not always chosen. Sometimes circumstances forced it: illness, poverty, loss, aging. And sometimes even those who preferred solitude needed help, needed companionship, needed connection to others to survive or to accomplish something that could not be done alone. The person who had been solitary for too long often lost the capacity to reach out, to ask for help, to accept connection when it was offered. They had built their life around not needing others, and when they finally needed others, they did not know how to access that need. They starved in isolation not because no one would help, but because they could not ask for help. Schopenhauer himself experienced this in small ways. When he finally found readers late in life, when disciples sought him out, he did not quite know what to do with them. He received them politely, but could not form real relationships. He had been alone too long. The capacity for connection had atrophied. The sixth danger was loneliness itself. Solitude and loneliness were not the same thing. Solitude was chosen. Loneliness was suffering. But prolonged solitude could tip into loneliness even for those who had chosen it. The recognition that you had no one, that if something happened to you no one would know or care, that your life was touching no other lives in any meaningful way, this could be painful even for those who generally preferred to be alone. Schopenhauer rarely admitted to loneliness in his published work. He defended solitude too consistently to acknowledge that it sometimes hurt. But in private notes, there were hints. Moments of wondering what his life might have been with companionship. Moments of recognizing that he had traded connection for freedom and sometimes wondered if the trade had been worth it. The honest assessment was that solitude was a trade, not a pure gain. You gained freedom, peace, time, protection from stupidity and malice. But you lost flexibility, connection, the benefits that came from contact with other perspectives, the possibility of relationships that might have enriched life, even if they also complicated it. Whether the trade was worth it depended on your nature, your capacities, your circumstances. For Schopenhauer, it was worth it. He was constitutionally unsuited for social life, intellectually driven in ways that required isolation, financially independent in ways that made isolation possible. His solitude was costly, but the alternative would have been worse. But not everyone was like him. Some people were genuinely social, found their best thinking in conversation rather than isolation, thrived on connection rather than being depleted by it. For such people, Schopenhauer's path was not wisdom, but mistake. They needed to find their own balance, different from his. The lesson was not that everyone should be solitary, it was that solitude was one way of living, with particular costs and benefits, suited to particular temperaments and circumstances. If you were the kind of person who could benefit from it, who had the inner resources to make it bearable and the discipline to make it productive, then solitude could be refuge. But you had to go into it with eyes open, understanding the dangers, prepared to manage them, willing to accept the trade-offs. Schopenhauer had done this. He had chosen solitude knowing what it cost, and he had built a life that was bearable despite its isolation. Whether this was wisdom or rationalization, whether he had made the best of his circumstances or simply made peace with his limitations, it was at least honest. He had not pretended that solitude was easy or purely beneficial. He had shown what it took to make it work and what it cost to maintain it. He had lived as he had advised. Alone, self-sufficient, depending on no one, his life shaped entirely according to his own judgment. The routine that had structured his days for 27 years had ended. The walks would not happen. The table at the Englischer Hof would be empty. The apartment would be cleared, the books dispersed, the manuscripts passed to executors who would prepare them for publication. Was he happy? almost certainly not by any conventional measure of happiness. He had spent most of his life in obscurity, ignored by the academic world, rejected by his mother, unable to form lasting relationships, bitter about the recognition that came too late. He believed existence was suffering, and that the best one could hope for was the reduction of suffering. He did not think life was good. He thought it was unbearable, made bearable through wisdom, discipline, and the cultivation of resources that made endurance possible. But he achieved something else, something that might matter more than happiness, a kind of integrity. He had seen clearly, or believed he had seen clearly, and he had lived according to what he saw. He had not lied to himself or to others. He had not pretended that life was better than it was. He had not pursued goals he believed to be illusory or maintained relationships he believed to be false. He had built a life that was honest, even if honesty made it lonely. He had also achieved what he had set out to achieve. He had thought through the questions that mattered to him, and he had written down what he thought. His major work, The World as Will and Representation, had finally found readers. His Parerga and Paralipomena was being discussed, translated, taught. He was no longer unknown. The recognition he had craved for decades had arrived, and while it came too late to change his life fundamentally, it provided satisfaction in his final years. More importantly, he had proved that a certain kind of life was possible, the life of the solitary thinker, independent of academic institutions, indifferent to fashion, devoted entirely to pursuing truth as he understood it. This was the life he had lived, and whatever its costs, it had produced work that would outlast him by centuries. Return to the room. The evening. The hours stretching ahead with nothing to fill them but your own thoughts. What have we learnt from Schopenhauer about solitude, about being alone, about what it takes to make aloneness bearable? First, that solitude reveals what you are when the social world is stripped away. For most people, the answer is nothing, an emptiness that must be filled from outside or else becomes unbearable. This is why most people flee solitude. Not because they love society, but because they fear themselves, or rather fear discovering that there is no self-worth being alone with. Second, that this emptiness can be filled from within. That one can cultivate thoughts, interests, capacities for contemplation that make solitude not merely bearable, but preferable to the company of most people. This is not easy. It is the work of years, perhaps of a lifetime, but it is possible, and those who accomplish it gain something rare: independence from external circumstance, the ability to be content anywhere because they carry their satisfaction within them. Third, that solitude is both refuge and danger. It offers freedom from performance, time for thought, protection from stupidity and malice. But it also risks eccentricity, rigidity, disconnection from reality, loss of the capacity to connect when connection might serve you. The wise person understands both the gifts and the costs, accepts the trade-offs, manages the dangers while preserving the benefits. Fourth, that the capacity to be alone is the mark of intellectual and spiritual development. Not because solitude is inherently superior to social life, but because it requires resources that most people lack. The person who can tolerate extended solitude has developed an inner life rich enough to sustain them. The person who cannot tolerate even brief solitude has not developed this and remains dependent on external stimulation to avoid confronting their own emptiness. Fifth, that most people are not worth the effort of knowing them. This sounds harsh, but Schopenhauer believed it was simply true. Most people's conversation is trivial, their thoughts conventional, their concerns petty. Time spent with them is time wasted or worse. The person who recognizes this and chooses solitude over bad company is not failing to connect but succeeding at discrimination. Better to be alone than to be with people who diminish you. Sixth, that even for those capable of solitude, some connection may be necessary. The completely isolated person risks losing touch with reality, becoming rigid, forgetting how to connect when connection might be valuable. The wisdom is not absolute solitude, but the ability to be alone when necessary, combined with the ability to connect when valuable, and the judgment to distinguish between the two. Seventh, that the purpose of cultivating the capacity for solitude is not solitude itself, but freedom. Freedom from the need for others' approval, from dependence on external circumstances, from the tyranny of boredom. The person who can be alone is the person who is truly free, because they are not forced into company they do not want, into performance they find exhausting, into dependence on others for their sense of well-being. Eighth, that this freedom comes at a cost. Schopenhauer paid it. A life without deep relationships, without family, without the warmth that comes from genuine connection. He believed the cost was worth it. He valued independence, clear thought, and the ability to pursue his work without compromise more than he valued connection. Others might make different calculations. The point is not that everyone should choose as he chose, but that anyone who chooses solitude should understand what they are choosing, both what they gain and what they give up. Ninth, that wisdom seeks not pleasure, but the absence of pain. This was Schopenhauer's fundamental insight about how to live. If you understand that existence is suffering, that the will is blind striving that can never be satisfied, that life swings between pain and boredom with no resting place, then you stop pursuing impossible goals like lasting happiness. Instead, you pursue achievable goals, limiting desires, cultivating inner resources, protecting your peace, finding moments of contemplation that offer temporary release from the pendulum. 10th, that even in an unbearable world, a bearable life is possible. Not a good life in any absolute sense, not a life that redeems the suffering of existence, but a life that can be endured, even occasionally serene. Schopenhauer found this. He did not find happiness or fulfillment or meaning, but he found a way to live that was honest, that produced something valuable, that was tolerable enough that he lived it to its natural end. The room is quiet, the hours stretch ahead. You are alone with your thoughts. Is this prison or refuge? Schopenhauer's answer: it depends entirely on what you have built within. If you have nothing, if your mind is empty, your interests superficial, your capacity for sustained thought undeveloped, then solitude is prison. The walls close in, the boredom is unbearable. You must flee to distraction or companionship, or anything that prevents you from confronting your own emptiness. But if you have built something, if you have cultivated genuine interests, developed the capacity for contemplation, learned to think for hours without external stimulation, then solitude is refuge. It is the condition under which you can finally be yourself. Think your own thoughts, live according to your own judgment without the constant pressure to perform for others. This building is the work, not of an evening or a month, but of years. It requires reading, thinking, practicing attention, developing genuine curiosities that can sustain themselves without external reinforcement. It requires learning to find objects of contemplation everywhere, learning to be interested in ideas for their own sake, learning to enjoy the activity of thinking without needing it to produce anything useful. Most people will not do this work. They will continue to flee solitude, to fill their time with distraction, to depend on others for any sense of satisfaction. And they will suffer for it because external circumstances change, because other people disappoint, because distraction cannot fill the void forever. But some will do the work. Some will read this and recognize themselves in Schopenhauer's analysis, see that their preference for solitude is not dysfunction, but the beginning of wisdom. Understand that the capacity to be alone is something to be cultivated rather than overcome. For those few, Schopenhauer offers a path. Not an easy path, not a path that leads to happiness, but a path that leads to something more valuable. The ability to exist in an unbearable world without lying to yourself about what you are experiencing. The ability to see clearly, think honestly, and build a life that can be endured even without illusions. He died alone, but he had lived as he chose, thought what he wanted to think, written what he believed to be true. His solitude was not failure but the condition of his work. His isolation was not punishment but protection. His life, by conventional standards, was empty. But by his own standards it was full of thought, full of work, full of sustained attention to questions that mattered to him. Was it a life worth living? He would have said that no life was worth living in any absolute sense, that existence was suffering and the best one could hope for was to make it bearable. But within those constraints, yes, he had lived a life worth living, a life that was his own, a life that produced something valuable, a life that demonstrated that a certain kind of solitary existence was possible and could be endured with dignity. The room is quiet. You are alone. Now you know what that means, what it offers, what it costs. Now you can choose to flee from it as most do, or to enter it, to build within it, to make it refuge rather than prison. The choice is yours, but whatever you choose, choose with eyes open, understanding both what you gain and what you give up. That at least is wisdom. That Schopenhauer can give you. The rest you must do yourself.